Baseball. It is as common as cigars and 1950s vehicles in Cuba. It has a heartbeat of its own in Latin America's most secluded country. Cubans pride themselves on baseball. It is their national sport, played all across the island by children as well as adults. But what people don't know is why baseball is so embedded into the heart of Cuba. For Cubans, baseball simply isn't a game, rather a lifestyle. Initially, baseball was introduced to Cuba in the 1860s by Cubans who left to study abroad at universities in the United States and then came back, as well as American traders and sailors who docked on Cuba's shores. A lot of credit towards the relevance of baseball in Cuba goes to Nemesio Gio. It is said that he was the first student traveling abroad to bring back a ball and a bat with him. In 1868, Nemesio and his brother Ernesto created the Havana Baseball Club, which would play teams of American sailors when they were docked in Cuba. Baseball really started to strike the hearts of Cubans when in 1869, Spain implemented a ban of baseball in Cuba. This took place during Cuba's first war of 3 wars against the Spaniards in a fight for independence. The Spanish banned baseball in Cuba because they felt that Cubans preferred baseball over bullfighting, which was mandatory for Cubans to attend. The Cubans then used baseball as a rebellious act against Spain and a silent protest, allowing for it to thrive across the island and become more than just a game. The ban also created another important event, the first ball player from Cuba to play in a major league within the United States. Esteban Bayon left Cuba to play for a couple of semi-pro teams in the U.S. before he joined the Troy Haymakers, which during his tenure joined the National Association, which was a major league at the time, and they joined in 1872. The first game ever recorded in Cuba's history took place in December 27, 1874, at the Palmer del Junco Stadium in Matanzas. The score is 51-9 in favor of Club Matanzas over Club Habana. 4 years later, the Cuban League was founded to once more protest the Spanish. The league originally consisted of 3 teams from Habana, Matanzas, and Almendares. As time rolled on, however, the league grew in size and competition. In fact, during the early 20th century, many Cuban league teams had success and won games against Major League Baseball teams from the U.S. A big part of their success can be attributed to the Cuban League allowing black players to play in their league starting in 1900, 48 years before Major League Baseball ended their segregational boundaries. Many stars from the U.S. Negro League would play winter ball in the Cuban League. Baseball continued to grow in prominence in Cuba. In fact, minor league baseball located some of its teams in Cuba during the mid-1900s. Cuba's players didn't only find success playing for teams based in Cuba. Many would play Major League Baseball during the first half of the 20th century and were actually allowed to play before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier for African Americans. Up until the 1960s, all was good with baseball in Cuba, but then everything went south. In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro led a revolution against Cuban President Fulgencio Batista and eventually took over the island. Batista was backed by the U.S. government, and Castro's revolt did not sit well with the U.S., especially because he turned Cuba into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. This caused President Eisenhower to sign off on a partial trade embargo against Cuba in 1960, and less than 2 years later, President Kennedy to execute a full trade embargo against Cuba. In 1962, the United States prohibited their citizens from traveling to Cuba or receiving imports from Cuba. This was quite a shock, considering Cuba was a hotspot for many well-recognized U.S. figures, such as Frank Sinatra and Ernest Hemingway. The tainted relationship between the United States and Cuba hurt baseball in Cuba, affecting the sport to this day. Fidel Castro wound up prohibiting any player from going to the United States and playing baseball there in 1962. But it wasn't simply the trade embargo or traveling restrictions that would cause him to ban his players from traveling to the U.S. to play. Fidel Castro was actually a huge fan of baseball, and he was a huge fan of the Havana Sugar Kings, a team based in Cuba. At the time his regime took over, the Sugar Kings were a part of a minor league baseball league in the United States. They were a AAA team in the International League, and they were associated with the Cincinnati Reds. On July 14, 1960, pro-Castro troops shot bullets into the air outside of the stadium during a game in a celebration of Cuban independence. 2 players on the field were hit as bullets fell from the sky, one player of the Sugar Kings and one player of their opponent, the Rochester Red Wings. The Red Wings refused to play the series finale the next day and flew home. It would end up being Havana's last season associated with the minor leagues in the U.S., as the team would end up being moved to New Jersey, as President Eisenhower pressured Major League Baseball Commissioner Ford Frick to relocate the team, so as to give the United States some leverage over Cuba. Castro was furious. He loved the Sugar Kings and told the United States and Major League Baseball he would take on and pay off any of the team's debts to keep them in Havana. Castro became even more agitated following the Bay of Pigs invasion 2 years later, as well as the continuous embargoes the United States put on Cuba, thus creating his ban of Cubans playing baseball in the United States. That created a shift in Cuban players in Major League Baseball. There were plenty of players prior to 1962 who played in either minor league baseball or in the majors. There was also a ban on any American talent coming to play in the Cuban League, which at the time was still renowned for its level of competitiveness. This caused about a 30-year gap in which there were very few Cuban players playing in the United States, with the majority having started playing there before Fidel Castro imposed the ban. It wasn't until the 1990s that Major League Baseball started to see Cuban ball players again. Fidel Castro made conditions even harder for his own Cuban ball players when he imposed a ban on players playing professionally in the United States, as he also announced that there would be no professional sports played in Cuba, only amateur sports. This meant that the ball players would be paid far less than they were accustomed to, and that their money would come from the government. The situation became drastically worse in 1991 when the Soviet Union, Cuba's main trading partner, collapsed. Cuba's economy took a downhill turn that to this day it hasn't recovered from. With the low wages and a weakened economy, some Cuban ball players started to take the risk of defecting in an attempt to play in the United States. Alexander Guerrero, who left Cuba in 2013 and eventually signed with the Los Angeles Dodgers, said he only made $17 a month to play baseball for 4 months a year in Cuba. Rene Arocha was the first player to defect from Cuba in the 1990s. He decided to make his escape during his tenure with the Cuban national team. In 1991, the team was on a layover in Miami's airport when Rene walked out of the airport and went to stay with family members who lived in the area. The reason the team was in Miami was because they had played a series of exhibition games in the United States. This method that Rene used, which was leaving during either an international tournament or a series of games that were being played outside of Cuba, became a common method used by players looking to leave Cuba. Typically, the player or a family member of theirs would secretly arrange to have representation for when they would defect that would take care of things like their paperwork and a passport, and they would make their escape. Today, the system is quite different as to how players escape from Cuba. It is not done anymore by players escaping during international tournaments. Rather, the players are defecting straight from the island of Cuba itself. But even that process has changed over time. Agencies used to send players to Mexico, but recently have been sending players to Haiti for a multitude of reasons. Geographically, Haiti is much closer to Cuba, and in Haiti, the agencies as well as the ball players don't have to deal with Los Zetas, the Mexican crime cartel. Haiti also borders the Dominican Republic, where all 30 major league teams host academies to scout for talent. Oftentimes, a player will arrive in Haiti and then will be smuggled into the Dominican Republic. The process of a player even getting to that point, or as they hope, the big leagues, runs far deeper than simply escaping and taking a boat to Haiti, however. It used to be that the agencies who would take care of the whole process would be on the down low, and that they weren't known well. The consequences of either the player or the agent being caught could be many years in Cuban jail. Now, there are a small number of big agencies well known to exist in Cuba that control 90% of the defections. There is a whole network of people the ball players must go through to try to achieve their goal. First, there are the recruiters. The recruiters attempt to persuade the ball players to leave the island. Sometimes the recruiters reach out to a ball player before the player tries to reach out to them. This occurred with Lirius Aguilera, who wound up defecting from Cuba in 2014. He was approached by a recruiter outside of his house on April 28, 2014. The recruiter told Aguilera that if he was interested in playing ball in the United States, he should meet him at 3 p.m. outside his house 2 days later. The recruiter also mentioned that Aguilera wasn't to say anything to his family. Aguilera made the decision to leave with the recruiter a couple days after they met. The ball player is then taken from a recruiter to a lanchero, which is a boat captain. The boat captain sneaks the player out of Cuba and into Haiti. This creates a lot of risk for anyone involved. There have been many stories of people attempting to flee Cuba who have been caught and jailed or who died stranded in the ocean. Once the ball player has been transported safely across the ocean that separates Cuba and Haiti, they are arranged with fixers. The fixers obtain residency papers for the player so that he can live legally in Haiti or the Dominican Republic. They also come into contact with middlemen who buy and sell the player but don't hold on to him. The middlemen usually sell the player to investors or agencies looking to score big on the player. This process can be almost as dangerous to the player as crossing the sea to get to Haiti. Crossing undocumented from Haiti into the Dominican Republic is illegal, and being caught can mean being sent back to Cuba. Once in the Dominican Republic, as long as the player is undocumented, he can be caught and sent back to Cuba. Dominican officers are known to crash a hotel or a house where many Cuban players are undocumented in the Dominican Republic and are staying. Rather than reporting them, the officers oftentimes demand money to keep it hushed. If the investor declines to pay the sum, the players are sent to Cuba. The officers have created a flawed system themselves, as many are involved, in that they know who the best players are, so then they'll find them and request bribes, because the better the player, the more money and bribes they can get. The investor usually gets the largest cut in the whole process, because they usually provide expenses for the whole thing to work, from the recruiters to the fixers to the lancheros. Typically, the investor will receive 30% of the first contract the player receives. The player is also given a trainer who prepares them and gets them into game shape, as well as an agent who deals with negotiations with teams. The ball player has no control in any of this, which adds in another risk, leaving your future in the hands of people who at the end of the day are using you to make themselves rich. Of course, the system is flawed already, given that a Cuban player must illegally defect from Cuba and illegally enter Haiti or the Dominican Republic. Of course, the system is flawed because the Cuban ball player isn't in control of what will happen to him next, as a result of being in the hands of so many people in a network that has become a business. But it's also flawed because many Cuban players are used as dolls and tricked into coming over. The reality of the system is that since 2014, more Cuban players have defected than at any span of time since Castro's regime took control. More than 350, in fact. The problem is, a lot of players that are smuggled out of Cuba are marginal players who won't play in the major leagues or even be signed to a minor league contract. An anonymous Cuban player said, "They sell you a dream," with an anonymous longtime agent adding, "It's not fair to the Cubans because they're sold a bill of goods. At the end of the day, the players are the victims." These victims, the players who don't make it, are trapped in a no man's land. It is said that once a ball player is in Haiti or the Dominican Republic for 8 months, his value deteriorates to just about nothing. So what does that mean for the player? It means that his investor generally backs out, leaving him with little to no money. It means his agent backs out and stops looking to negotiate with major league teams or trying to get an academy to invite a player. It means the men who were handling the player's documents and in process of legalizing his residency in Haiti or the Dominican Republic stop working on it. It means that the ball player is broke, without residency anywhere, and without any working skills because all he's known and grown up in is baseball. This leaves the ball player with one of 3 options. He can report himself to Dominican authority and be sent back to Cuba, which isn't as bad today as they are accepted because the government-backed league has been so drained of its players. He can stay in the Dominican and look to find work, or he can try to leave and gain residency in the United States. Which begs the question, why wouldn't a player have just gained residency in the United States rather than have gone through this whole process? The answer is simply that that wouldn't be where the money lies. To escape, the player would have to find someone to take them to the US, and the investors as well as the player most of the time would prefer to go the other route. This is because the way Major League Baseball works is that if a player is a resident of the United States or Canada, he must enter himself into the amateur draft in order to play, meaning he would earn less money right away. For an international player, however, once he's 23, he may become a free agent, and if he waits until 25, he can command a contract with no restrictions and earn as much money as a team is willing to offer. hence the reason a player would go the route used today as opposed to gaining citizenship in the United States. It is worth noting that as recently as 2013, players could fly commercial airlines to the Dominican Republic without having been granted a visa by the Cuban government. It might sound like this makes everything easier, but they're still a part of the same network because someone needs to pay for their ticket, someone needs to get their documents in order, and someone needs to help them negotiate with teams, meaning that most every Cuban player has to go through this process anyway. As for where this situation heads in the future, it isn't easy to predict. Major League Baseball would like to create an easier path for Cubans to reach the major league levels, but until Congress votes to lift the current embargo, legally it is impossible. President Obama's administration took some steps towards easing restrictions on the embargo. There was never a full-fledged removal of the embargo. Recently, President Trump's administration has actually tightened the restrictions on United States travel to Cuba, going against what the previous administration had planned. He did say that the United States would keep their embassy open in Cuba, however. That would make it likely that the embargo will be lifted under the current administration in office. If it ever will be lifted is unpredictable as well, as the United States does not agree with some of Cuba's policies, and is reluctant to come to a full relationship with Cuba if certain things don't change. As for the ball player, this could mean even more decades of shady processes to get to the United States, which is unfortunate for both them and baseball. The process of getting them to the major leagues is inhumane, but for those who make it, their effect on baseball is grand. Take Yasiel Puig, who helped lead the Los Angeles Dodgers to the World Series in 2017.
Giles was watching with the rest of us. Puig hits one a ton to left. It's a one-run game.
Or Yulieski Gurriel, who helped the Astros defeat Puig and the Dodgers win it all a year ago.
That is smoked. It is gone. 1-0 Houston.
The year prior, Aroldis Chapman helped the Chicago Cubs win their first World Series since 1908.
30th of October, 2016. That will be a game 6.
And 3 years ago, Yoenis Cespedes helped lead the Mets to the World Series.
Couple of runs scored, and that ball is absolutely scorched to left. 3-run shot, and the Mets have blown it open.
Cuban players have been vital to teams on baseball's biggest stage for the past 3 years and in various other years. There are players elsewhere too who have made big impacts to their teams as well, perhaps none bigger than Jose Fernandez. He fled Cuba 3 different times and was actually jailed for a year before making it successfully out of the country during his 4th attempt. He played for the Miami Marlins until he tragically died in September 2016 in a boating accident. With the trajectory of his career flying high, he may have ended up being one of the greatest Cuban players ever had he been able to finish his career. It wasn't just on the field that made him special, however. He played in Miami, a town with a huge Cuban population. He was a fan favorite in a stadium where many fans were of Cuban heritage. He showed hope to many who may have not seen it before. And that's exactly what these Cuban ball players are to their fellow countrymen back home. Hope. Hope for a brighter world in a country under dictatorial rule with a crumbling economy stuck in the 1950s. And hope for the young kids who grow up in Cuba playing baseball, a sport that has become as much as a pastime for them as it has for us in the United States.